everyone, and welcome to Pep Talk's brand new webinar series, PepTalk Presents. And I'm really excited to say that we are starting this series strong with today's exclusive Pep Talk speaker, Martin Gutmann. Martin is a professor at the Luzern School of Business, a senior lecturer at the ETH Zurich, and best-selling author of The Unseen Leader, which is a book that organizational psychologist Adam Grant has called provocative and eye-opening take on what history really teaches us about leadership. Martin's ideas have reached millions around the world through Forbes, the New York Times, Fast Company, Big Think, and his TED Talk, which has now been watched over 2 million times. Just to let you know, if you have any questions for Martin during his talk, please use the chat to send them in and we will answer them at the end. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Martin Gutmann for today's talk, The Secret to Leading High-Performing Teams and Organizations.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Thanks for that lovely introduction. And thanks to all of you for spending some of your precious lunch hour time with me discussing leadership and high-performance teams, topics that are very near and dear to my heart. And before I get into the talk itself, I'd like to ask you a simple question, and please be ready to use the Zoom function, raise your hand. All right, so my question is, please raise your hand if you know who this is. Yes, of course. Everybody knows Michael Jordan, right? Not only one of the best basketball players of all time, if not the, but perhaps one of the best athletes across any sport. I mean, he was just beautiful and mesmerizing to watch. I actually had the chance to see him play once when I was about 14. And I still remember to this day, this energy in the arena every time he touched the ball. I mean, this man just had this drive in him. It was absolutely amazing. Now, let me ask you this. Please use the Zoom function to raise your hand if you know who this is. Nobody. Yes. Don't feel bad. This is Bill Cartwright, and very few people, including basketball players, don't know who he is. But here's the thing. If you want to understand what made Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls so successful, you need to understand Bill Cartwright. And to say that the Bulls were successful, I think, is an understatement, right? I think there's a compelling case to be made for considering the Chicago Bulls in the 1990s the best team in the history of sports. So the question is, what was their secret? If you'd asked me when I was 14, I would have said, simple. Their secret is Michael Jordan, period. And I suspect I wouldn't have been alone in that opinion or that assessment, right? I think many of us have this inborn assumption that great individual talent is the secret to great teams and organizations. But now that I've spent the majority of my adult life examining leadership and teams and organizations of the past and the present, I know that it's actually a lot more complicated than that, right? And I also appreciate that many of you probably care very little about basketball. And to be honest, I neither watch nor play basketball anymore. But the story of Jordan and the Bulls can teach us about something I think we all care a lot about, which is sustained excellence, right? What enables some groups of individuals to get together and create something truly remarkable together, not just once, but day in and day out. That's what I want to talk to you about today. And the talk has 3 parts. First, the what. So what is the secret behind high performance teams? Next is the how. How can leaders make this happen? And finally, I'd like to make the case for why this type of leadership and these types of teams and organizations are particularly important for the problems that our organizations and society is facing today. So with that, let's launch into the what, right? What enables some teams and organizations to truly outperform the rest? And if we look at the science of high performance organizations, we first have to talk about a couple of so-called hurdle requirements, right? These are things that, like, check boxes that a team or an organization has to fulfill. If you fail to clear these hurdles, you're out of the race for sure. But clearing them alone, of course, doesn't guarantee you will win, right? So what are these in the sense now of business teams and organizations, not athletic teams? Well, there are 3 hurdle requirements, and they all start with a C. The first one is clarity, right? It needs to be clear to everyone on a team where it is that you want them to go and how you're measuring success, right? You can be the most inspiring leader in the world, but if people don't know where you want to go, they can't help you get there, right? The next one is capacity, right? You need talented individuals who can do the job, can do the tasks that you're asking of them, and they also need the right tools, the right information, and so forth. And finally, there's communication and coordination, right? Information needs to flow properly, work needs to be sequenced and aligned, and so on. I work with a lot of leaders, I work with a lot of teams, and many of them struggle just to get these 3 hurdle requirements right? These are not simple to accomplish in an organizational setting. But assuming that you do check these off, then there's something else that sets the truly exceptional teams and organizations apart. And those are 2 things. The first one is what we might call high standards, right? There has to be a collective understanding that the bar is really high in terms of quality and in terms of expectation, right? There has to be a drive, a sense of urgency, and a real focus on kind of getting results. And, leaders are pretty good at this. Like, this is what we do, quite naturally. We like to add some pressure, make people feel like, what we do is really important. But there's a second piece to the puzzle as well. And to make that point, let's transition quickly to Google of about a decade ago. So in 2012, Google hired a small army of organizational psychologists to help them unravel what to them was a big mystery, right? Google then, as now, had incredibly high standards, right? And they hired only the best, right? They had a lot of talent. There was a Michael Jordan or 2 on every one of Google's teams. But performance across Google's hundreds of teams varied wildly, right? Some teams were crushing it, some were rather disappointing. And the researchers assumed it had something to do with team composition. Who was working with whom? So they set about collecting data on this. But here's what one of the researchers later wrote. We had lots of data, but there was nothing showing that a mix of specific personality types, of skills or backgrounds made any difference. The who part of the equation didn't matter. Instead, it turned out what mattered was how people on the teams interacted rather than who was on the team. Right? All of the high performance teams at Google had an environment which we might call supportive, right? A supportive community where every individual felt valued, felt seen, and felt trusted, right? Psychological safety. And what we've learned since the Google study days, is that these are not 2 check marks, 2 polls, right? But it's really about embedding high standards within a supportive community. And the other thing we've learned since the Google study days is that this type of environment doesn't emerge by accident, right? It's a product of good leadership. So that brings us to the how, right? How can leaders make this happen? How can they cultivate this environment? Well, I think the first step many organizations take is to say, well, if this is the type of environment we want, let's just encode it into our HR values, into our onboarding material, et cetera. And that's good, right? It's good to kind of write down that you value quality, but also trust and respect, right? But as anybody who's taken an intro to sociology module back in the university days knows, stated values don't change behavior, right? If this is the type of environment you want, then it has to start in you as a leader, right? You have to find in yourself a balance between a focus on results and a focus on relationships, right? A balance between a focus on tasks and a focus on trust. And in recent years, one such balance that is absolutely crucial for leaders to embody has emerged in a series of studies. A balance between drive and humility. And the humility bit is bigger here, and it's also in white because that's the one that most leaders really struggle with, struggle to understand, and struggle even more with trying to implement in themselves. So that's the one I want to talk to you about here, also because we don't have quite so much time. So what is humility in a leader? Well, first, it's having an appreciation of others' strengths and contributions, right? Not in a token way, but in fundamentally valuing and recognizing each team member for who they are and what they bring to the table. The next is teachability and an openness to learning. Again, sounds simple, right? But it's about fundamentally walking through the world with the assumption that I do not have all the answers. And some of the things I believe might be wrong. And finally, humility involves a willingness to acknowledge one's limits and failures. This is a tough one for many of us, myself included, right? I was socialized to think of, feeling nervous or having imposter syndrome as being something I should try to overcome. Fake it until you make it, right? Nothing could be further from the truth, recent studies tell us. Let me give you an example. MIT professor Basima Tafik has studied medical students who have imposter syndrome. That is, medical students who are not quite sure if they have what it takes to be good doctors. And she's found that medical students with imposter syndrome actually do no worse at diagnosing patients correctly. However, they were rated much higher by patients in areas such as empathy, professionalism, and respect. So what does this look like in real life, like in real leadership examples, right? Owning up to your own limitations and owning failures. One great example on the limitations bit is Jacinda Ardern, who was the Prime Minister of New Zealand, you'll all recall, during the COVID-19 pandemic. And you'll also recall that she had some of the highest trust ratings among any leader globally, even once COVID-19 reached the shores of New Zealand, right? And she became known for making statements such as, "We will never pretend we have all the answers, and there's no guarantee that our approach will succeed." Right? Studies have shown that this kind of openness to your own limitations actually builds trust, and it signals confidence. Let me give you another example, specifically about kind of owning failure from the perspective of a leader. These images were taken the day before the D-Day, the cross-channel invasion in World War II. And they show the Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower, trying to motivate and encourage the paratroopers right as they're about to board the planes before being dropped over occupied France. Right? And so he has a lot of confidence, a lot of drive. But when Eisenhower went back to his cabin that night, he penned the following note. And it reads, "Our landings in the Cherbourg Harbor area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops." And then he writes this particular operation, but he crosses that out. And instead of this particular operation, he writes, "My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone," which he subsequently underlines. Right? This is leadership. Right? If the invasion had failed, Eisenhower could have blamed any number of people or any number of circumstances. But that never crossed his mind. And it was always clear to him that success would be collectively owned, failure would be his to own. And he penned this note, folded it up, put it in his wallet in case he would need it the next day. Of course, he didn't. Drive and humility, and especially the humility bit, has been shown in a series of recent studies to boost productivity, innovation, and problem solving in the teams of that leader, and also to increase satisfaction and trust. So in other words, if this is the environment that you want, a good place to start as a leader is to balance the drive you likely already have with humility. Now, the thing is, it doesn't just end with you as a leader, right? It also depends on who you choose to profile within your team and organization. And to make this example, let's go back to the Bulls now. And this image here shows Phil Jackson, who was the coach of the Bulls. He took over coaching the Bulls in 1989. And when he took over the Bulls, Michael Jordan was already there, and Michael Jordan was the captain, meaning on the court, whether in practice or in games, Michael Jordan set the pace, right? And we've talked about high standards and drive. Michael Jordan had really high standards for himself and everyone else, right? So high, in fact, that when players weren't performing to his preferred standard, he would go after them and yell at them and really give them a hard time. And there was one player in particular who suffered a lot, we might call it, at the hands of Michael Jordan, Bill Cartwright. Okay. And to be fair, by this point, Cartwright was well past his prime. Here's how one sports writer described Cartwright. He was clumsy and unflashy, had terrible knee problems, didn't block many shots, and couldn't catch passes unless they were thrown directly at his nose. Okay, so not the best basketball player anymore. At the start of the season in 1991, Coach Phil Jackson did something remarkable. He made Bill Cartwright co-captain with Michael Jordan. Why? Well, because Cartwright was good at relating to people, right? He had humility. He enjoyed talking to younger players. He was the guy who, when you missed a shot, he'd come over, put an arm around your shoulder and say, it's all good. You'll get the next one, right? He created the supportive community, the psychological safety, the trust, and the valuing of everyone to balance out the other necessary side of the equation, Michael Jordan's obsession with performance. The team changed essentially overnight. They started consistently winning, including the first of 6 championships that decade. And even Jordan himself, is not a very humble guy, admitted at the end of his season, Bill made all the difference. So why is this type of leadership, right, that balances drive with humility and the environment it creates that also feels supportive in addition to this shared, focus on performance and excellence? Why is this particularly important today? Well, because the need for collaborative work is growing in the sense that problems that in the past could be solved by one employee now increasingly, because of complexity, because of time sensitivity, because of interlinkages, requires a pooling of efforts. It requires collaboration to solve. We see this across industries, right? And at the same time that this need for collaborative, true collaborative work and teams that are able to do that is growing, there's a trend in the opposite direction. We see employee engagement declining across the globe, across sectors. In fact, a survey that was conducted last year of 184,000 companies across the globe, across sectors, found that 77% of employees did not feel engaged at work. They did not feel connected to their organization's values and mission, and they did not feel seen and valued and supported by their leaders. Right? So this is a true crisis, and I think it's a crisis that calls for a reimagining of leadership. Right? To seeing leadership not just as being about creating high standards and pressure, but also about building a supportive community. This is what set the high performance teams at Google apart. It set the Chicago Bulls apart, and it sets many of the best teams and organizations today apart as well. This brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you so much for listening. Before I see if there are any questions out there, let me quickly tell you about the four primary keynotes that I deliver to corporate clients and conferences around the globe. There's the talk that you just listened to, The Secret to High Performance Teams. I also do a much longer version in which I can focus on any number of elements, such as psychological safety, or examine drive and humility in greater detail, etc. I also give a very popular talk on how leaders need to respond to the changes brought by artificial intelligence, both in organizations that are AI heavy, but also in ones that are not, right? AI calls for a different type of leadership, and that's what I look at in this talk. I also have my classic TED Talk that I do in a corporate environment about why we tend to celebrate the loud, the brash leaders and overlook those who might actually create the most positive and meaningful change within organizations. And of course, I tell you what you can do within your cultures to change that. And finally, I have a talk around the leadership playbook for an uncertain world. The world is really uncertain, really crisis dense. How can leaders, especially who are exposed to this more than others, respond? Thank you so much for listening. Kelly, do we have any questions coming in?
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Martin, for that talk. Honestly, I feel so fortunate. I've obviously seen you talk in the past, and every time I walk away from your talks, I just gain so much. And the thing that stands out for me the most is always how you talk about recognizing and looking out for those sort of Cartwright leaders as opposed to always those Michael Jordans. And that just always stands out for me. So thank you so much for sharing that wisdom with us today. Yes, we have a few questions, just conscious of time, but let's see what we can get through in the time that we have. So we've got a question that's come through asking, do you have any advice for, and I'm sure lots of people will resonate with this, do you have any advice for developing high-performing teams that are primarily remote versus in person?
That's a great question. And I think the question, acknowledges the fact that there are certain challenges around building team cohesion in a remote, in an online setting. It's not impossible, but it is more challenging, of course. And there's a lot to it, but just to kind of bring in one key thought here, I think it's absolutely crucial for leaders in such an environment to remember to use their communication, whether it's oral in Zoom meetings or it's written, not just to focus on the tasks and the task relevant information, right? But to also prioritize the human connection, the chit chatting, the giving feedback, the receiving feedback, etc. It's really easy to forget about that and just focus on the tasks at hand. So that would be my piece of advice there.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I think when we're working remotely, it's probably cliche, but we do miss those kind of water cooler chats and that kind of building of the rapport and the trust and everything else. And it's easy to just sit behind emails. So you're so right, being able to still have that human element and building that rapport with people is so important, and delivering maybe those tough messages around feedback, whether that's positive or
Yeah.
not so positive,
Yeah.
is really useful. So thanks for that. The next question I have here is, how can I help the leaders in my organization lead better?
I mean, leadership is complex, right? It's really about having a broad toolkit at your disposal, from communication skills to humility and drive, and there's a lot to it. But I think underlying all of that is awareness, right? To be a good leader, you need to be aware of what you're already doing well and where you have deficits, and how my communication style, my behavior, how that is impacting those people around me. So awareness, I think, is critical. And there are many different ways that leaders can cultivate better awareness. I mean, coaching is one great way to do it. I think also just hearing stories such as the ones I mentioned in this talk can give you a different perspective and a different awareness that can also enable leaders to change how they view themselves and those around them. But I think it starts with awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't change what we're not aware of. So, yeah, I think you're so right there. Thank you so much. We have got a few questions, but I'm just going to choose one last one. And this is actually someone talking about psychological safety. And they've just said, I know psychological safety is key, but senior management doesn't seem to see it that way. How can I shift their perspective? If you have any advice on that.
Yeah, that is really tough, right? And you will have noticed in the talk that I gave, I don't use the term so much because in some ways I think the term is unfortunate because it makes safety makes it sound like cuddly, and a lot of leaders feel like, we don't need that, because we got to perform, etc. So I like the term supportive community more because it's really about an environment where people have the support that they need to be able to do the things that you're asking them to do, right? Um, but I still get it. A lot of especially older leaders, not all, but many feel like the touchy feely stuff, the support, people should just be resilient and just get on with the job. Um, it's tough. I think um, either there's a point where you can say to yourself, I'm in the wrong organization, right? And maybe I need to seek a different environment, or control the environment that you can, right? Even if you're in a very competitive, driven organization, um, you still have control over your team. And if you can create a psychologically safe environment, this environment that combines, drive with a supportive community, your team will likely outperform others, and that will raise eyebrows, and that might be the moment to introduce what you have done to create this incredible team, and perhaps you'll change some minds.
Love that actually, because I think that's probably a lot of challenges that lots of organizations are facing in terms of we've got multitude of generations working together now, don't we? So actually how people are coming to work and showing up at work is very different. The expectations of work is different.
Totally.
But I love what you say there actually is actually lead by example.
Yeah.
Control the controllables, be that leader within your team,
Yeah.
and then you can kind of show up as an example, where you can. So
Yeah.
brilliant. Martin, thank you so much for being with us today. That was a fantastic talk, and obviously just a taster of what you can bring to
Yeah.
organizations. So if anybody out there is interested in booking Martin for your next leadership talk, which I would highly recommend, then get in touch with anybody that you work with at Pep Talk, and we would be happy to organize that with you. Even if you're interested in just having a conversation, understanding a little bit more about him, get in touch and we can help give you that information. So thanks again, Martin. Thank you to everybody who joined us today, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, Martin. Bye.